When George Wilson gave away his entire fortune, he had no idea that his mute assistant, Robert, was hiding a dark truth about his family. The secrets that would soon emerge would turn George's life upside down, revealing a horrifying injustice he never suspected. What happened next would shock even the most cynical. But let's start from the very beginning. George Wilson was a man known throughout the country. The owner of one of the largest chains of luxury hotels in America, his name had become synonymous with success and wealth. Press conferences, high society events, and deals that sent stock indexes soaring. That was his life, under constant scrutiny. Newspapers chronicled his achievements, financial analysts tracked his every move, and competitors dreamed of stealing his clients but feared his influence. In the business world, George Wilson's name inspired not just respect but fear. Yet despite all of this, deep inside, George felt utterly alone. Every day he would rise to the 57th floor of his office with its panoramic city views, but instead of pride in the empire he had built, he was gripped by apathy. Once he had enjoyed the flow of money into his accounts, the way employees bowed before him, and the deals that brought millions. But none of that mattered anymore. Neither the luxury cars, nor the private jets, nor the villas in the world's most beautiful locations brought him joy. One day, during lunch, when the office was empty, George sat in his massive oak chair and looked at the enormous glass table in front of him. The table was littered with dozens of folders containing financial reports, contracts, and projects that could bring him even more millions. But something inside him broke. He realized that all of this was just an escape from the emptiness that money could not fill. Everyone around him, business partners, family members, employees, now seemed like strangers. He felt they were there only to claim their share of his fortune. George understood that his entire world revolved around his money, not genuine relationships. This revelation hit him unexpectedly and hard. He gazed out the window at the bustling city below, cars racing by, people walking on sidewalks, busy with their daily lives. He thought, these people live, strive for something, fight for something. And what about me? I built an empire, but I've lost the meaning of life. In that moment, he was overwhelmed by an inexplicable urge. George reached for the phone and called his lawyer. "Prepare the documents," he said in a hoarse voice. "I'm donating my entire fortune to charity." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The lawyer, a man who had known George for many years, was stunned. "Are you sure, Mr. Wilson?" he asked timidly, hoping this was just a momentary lapse. But George was resolute. He could no longer live a life that had nothing left but the accumulation of money. He felt that giving away his entire fortune would be his liberation from the emptiness that had consumed him for years. Wilson sought something greater, something that couldn't be measured in dollars. He wanted peace of mind and, perhaps, to rediscover himself. When news of his decision spread, the world was shocked. The media exploded with coverage, dissecting the actions of one of America's most influential figures. Experts speculated about what had driven Wilson to take such a radical step. Some suggested it was a bid for attention, after years of being out of the spotlight. Others claimed he was facing serious issues that had forced him to take such drastic measures. The rumors spread like wildfire. George's colleagues thought his decision was a sign of madness. Many openly said he had lost touch with reality. His former business partners couldn't believe that a man who had spent decades building his wealth could just give it all away in an instant. One said, "This is an act of desperation. No sane person would give everything away for some abstract ideal." However, the most severe blow came from George's family. His son, Bennett, who had been preparing to take over the company, saw his father's decision as a personal betrayal. He believed his father was robbing him of his future, leaving him with nothing. George's wife, Marian, who had always supported him, couldn't hide her disappointment this time. She understood that their comfortable life was now a thing of the past. Despite all the criticism, George stood firm in his decision. He believed that by freeing himself from the burden of wealth, he could finally find his path to inner peace. As soon as George announced his decision to give away his entire fortune, the situation around him began to deteriorate rapidly. Where once he had been surrounded by admiration and respect, he now faced reproach, anger, and outrage. Everyone who had once seen George as a pillar of stability and success now viewed him as a man who had deprived them of their future. A wave of negativity crashed down on him, engulfing both his professional and personal life. The first to lash out was his son, Bennett. At 35, Bennett had been raised in a world of luxury and was preparing to inherit his father's empire. He had always believed that his future lay in continuing the business that George was so proud of. For Bennett, there was nothing more important than the day when he would officially take his father's place, under the applause of shareholders and the approval of the press. When he learned of his father's decision to give away the entire fortune to charity, his world collapsed. He felt deceived, betrayed, and worst of all, stripped of his destiny. Bursting into George's office, his face contorted with anger, he yelled, "How could you? Are you out of your mind? Everything you've built, everything I've worked for all these years, you're just going to throw it away for people you don't even know? This is ours. This is my future." But George, with cold composure, replied, "This was my empire, Bennett, and I decide what to do with it. Money no longer means anything to me. If you understood that, you wouldn't be angry. You'd be searching for your own path." Those words felt like a punch to Bennett's heart. He couldn't accept that his father, the man he had always viewed as the unshakable pillar of their family, now appeared weak and lost. Convinced that his father was losing his sanity, Bennett resolved to take action. In secret, he contacted lawyers to find ways to challenge his father's decision in court. He was prepared to contest the donation, declare George incompetent, whatever it took to preserve what he believed was rightfully his. In his mind, George had become a madman, willing to destroy everything for some moral satisfaction. Meanwhile, George's wife, Marian, took matters into her own hands from a different angle. Though their marriage had long lost its warmth, Marian was a woman accustomed to luxury and status. She had always supported her husband as long as he was the source of her comfort. But now, with George abandoning everything that made their life comfortable, Marian felt it was time to look out for herself. She wasn't about to be left with nothing after so many years of marriage. Marian coldly and calculatingly filed for divorce. She demanded her share of the assets before George could give it all away to the poor. For her, it wasn't just a matter of survival, but revenge for the betrayal she felt. "You're leaving us with nothing for people who don't even know your name," she told him, hoping to stir some emotions. But George remained unshaken. He understood that their relationship had long been based on money, not love. And now that the money was gone, her true motives had become clear. Amidst all the hostility and deceit, there was one person who remained by George's side, his silent assistant, Robert. This mute man had been by Wilson's side for many years, watching his career and his rise to prominence. Mute from birth, Robert had never spoken or shown emotion. He simply did his job, efficiently, silently, without asking questions. To George, he was like a shadow, an unnoticed and faithful executor of all his tasks. Robert was always there, helping George with his daily affairs. He never interfered in conversations, never got involved in family disputes, and never passed judgment on his boss's decisions. But for George, Robert had become more than just an employee. In a world where everyone was trying to take something from him, Robert was one of the few people who demanded nothing in return. He didn't ask questions about the money, didn't express dissatisfaction or disapproval when George decided to donate his entire fortune. His silence was a source of comfort to Wilson amidst the storm of betrayal surrounding him. With each passing day, as everyone else turned away, Robert stayed. He silently carried out his tasks, as if trying to tell George without words, "I'm here, and I'm not leaving." And although George had always seen him as just a good worker, in those moments he began to realize that Robert was the only person he could truly rely on. Several months had passed since George Wilson announced his decision to donate his vast fortune to charity. His life had completely changed. Most of the real estate, stocks, and bank accounts had already been transferred to various organizations. Now, his name was mentioned in an entirely different context, not as a millionaire, but as a man who had chosen to radically change his life. However, despite these external changes, George was still deeply unsettled inside. He had lost his family, most of his friends, and business partners. Everything that once seemed stable now appeared to be an illusion. And most importantly, he still hadn't found the inner peace he so desperately sought. But during these difficult months, one thing remained unchanged: Robert's silent presence. He was always with George, in the office, during rare meetings, and most oddly, even at home. Robert, who had always been a shadow, suddenly began to constantly be by his side, as if afraid to leave George alone. At first, George didn't give it much thought, since Robert was the only one who hadn't turned away from him. But over time, Robert's constant presence began to raise questions in George's mind. He started noticing strange things. Robert would stand at the door of his office, as if waiting for orders, even though he usually waited in another room. Sometimes he even showed up without being summoned, as if he somehow knew in advance that George needed company. George tried to understand what had changed in his assistant's behavior. What could have caused him to grow so attached to his employer after so many years of silent service? At one point, George became so curious that he decided to invite Robert to dinner at his home. It was an unusual decision, as they had never interacted outside of work, let alone in a personal setting. But George needed some form of communication, some sense of connection with another person. That evening, everything was kept simple. George chose a quiet night to avoid interruptions. He and Robert sat at the large wooden table in George's spacious dining room, where his family once gathered. The atmosphere was somewhat tense, and silence hung in the air. Robert, as always, didn't say a word, quietly eating, but George sensed that there was something deeper hidden in his silence. At one point, George noticed Robert staring intently at a photograph hanging above the fireplace. It was a picture of George's mother, taken many years ago. She had always held an important place in his life, even though she had passed away when he was still young. The photograph, where she smiled while holding little George in her arms, had always reminded him of a time before his life became consumed by money and power. He looked at Robert, noticing that his gaze was unusually focused on the photo, and something about that unsettled him. It seemed that Robert was looking at it with a kind of special emotion that George couldn't understand. Almost without thinking, George asked, "Do you know her?" It was a simple question, but George didn't expect Robert to react in any meaningful way. Robert looked up, and something flickered in his eyes. Instead of speaking, he quietly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a notebook and pen, the only way he communicated due to his mute condition. George sat, expecting Robert to write a few routine words, but instead, Robert began writing something long and intense. With each passing moment, George's heartbeat grew faster. When Robert finished, he handed the paper to George. George took it and began reading. Each word on the page hit him like a hammer. Robert had written, "She is my mother." George froze. He couldn't believe his eyes. His mute assistant, who had been with him for so many years, turned out to be his half-brother, the son of the very woman George had long believed dead. Robert explained that their mother, the same woman who had given birth to George, had left the family when George was still a child. She left their father, leaving George in a wealthy home while she went to live in poverty with Robert, her second son, whom George had never known about. Unable to cope with the pressures of a life overshadowed by wealth, she chose to leave with her younger child, someone George had never even known existed. Robert had always known about his older brother, but having been raised in poverty, he never felt worthy of meeting him. For all those years, Robert had stayed by George's side, silently fulfilling all his tasks, concealing his identity, but always observing his brother's life. He had become the shadow of his wealthy sibling, preferring to remain close in the role of a humble servant, rather than staying away. He had always known that George was his brother, but he could never bring himself to reveal the truth. George sat in complete shock. He couldn't believe that all these years he had lived alongside his own brother, someone he had never known. The irony of the situation struck him, at the very moment when he had decided to rid himself of his wealth, when his own family had turned against him. The one person who had stayed by his side was connected to him by blood. The revelation that Robert was his half-brother left George in a state of deep confusion. He felt as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted. For years, he had seen Robert as nothing more than a silent assistant, someone dependable, yet distant. Now, everything had changed. George felt both betrayed and guilty. Betrayed because the truth had been hidden from him for so long, and guilty for not realizing it sooner. All this time, his own brother had been working for him, silently observing, never revealing his true identity. George didn't know how to react. The anger, confusion, and disbelief collided inside him, making it difficult to think clearly. But more than anything, he felt an overwhelming need for answers. Why had Robert never told him the truth? Why had their mother kept them apart? And most importantly, why had Robert chosen to remain silent all these years? George invited Robert to sit down, the tension palpable in the air. He could barely look him in the eyes, but he knew this conversation had to happen. Robert, as always, remained silent, his face calm, but showing traces of an inner struggle. George broke the silence. Why? Why didn't you ever tell me? George's voice was a mix of frustration and hurt. Robert hesitated for a moment, then picked up his pen and notebook, writing carefully before handing it to George. You had your life. I had mine. I didn't want to disrupt yours. George's mind raced. But we're family. We should have been there for each other. His voice was raised now, frustration building. Why did our mother leave? Why didn't she tell me about you? Robert wrote again. She left because she was scared. Scared of the life our father built. Scared of what money was doing to us. I was just a baby. She thought you'd be better off without us. George stood up, pacing the room as he processed this. His mind was clouded with memories of his childhood. He remembered his mother as a loving but distant figure, someone who was often overwhelmed by the demands of their father's ambitions. But he had always believed she left for different reasons. Now, knowing the truth, everything felt different, more complicated. She thought I'd be better off, George muttered bitterly. Look at what my life became. I may have had everything, money, power, but I was always alone. He stopped and turned to face Robert. You were right here, and I didn't even know. Robert's expression softened as he wrote another note. You weren't alone. I've always been here, watching over you. The weight of those words hit George hard. He realized that in a strange way, Robert had always been by his side, not as a brother, but as a silent protector, ensuring George's well-being from the shadows. The revelation made George feel even more lost. He had been blind to the truth, consumed by his own success, and now the only person who had remained loyal was the one he never even knew. There was a long silence between them, both men processing the deep emotions stirred by the conversation. George sat back down, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had just learned. But beyond the confusion and anger, there was also a flicker of something else, relief. Despite everything, he now knew he wasn't truly alone. He had a brother, and though their relationship was complicated, perhaps there was still time to make amends. Finally, George spoke, his voice softer. Why didn't you ever leave? You could have had your own life, away from all this. Why stay with me? Robert took a deep breath before writing. You're my brother. I wanted to protect you. Even if you didn't know me, I knew you. And I saw what money and power did to you. I stayed because I hoped one day you'd see it too. George felt tears welling up in his eyes. He had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. His money, his influence, his status. But Robert had stayed without asking for anything, simply out of a sense of familial loyalty. It was a concept foreign to George, who had become so cynical about human motives. And yet, here was the proof that true loyalty still existed, even in silence. For a long time they sat in silence. The past had come crashing into the present, but now there was a chance for the future to be different. George realized that for the first time in years, he didn't feel as empty as before. He had lost much, his fortune, his family. But he had gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that someone had always cared for him, even when he hadn't known it. I don't know what to say. George finally admitted, his voice trembling. I feel like I failed as a brother, as a person. Robert shook his head and wrote, It's never too late. We're still here. George looked at the words and nodded slowly. He knew that the road to healing would be long and difficult. There was still so much to process about their mother, their father, their lost time. But for the first time in a long while, George felt like he wasn't facing it alone.